A little before third bell the next morning, Myne and Lutz made their way to the plaza to wait for Freida. It took Myne exactly 30 seconds to realize she had no idea what Freida looked like. Not her hair color, not her height, nothing. She was about to panic when Lutz pointed out that the Merchants Guild was right there, and Freida's grandfather knew perfectly well what they looked like. That settled it. While they waited, Lutz told her how his family had reacted to the money he brought home. They were pleased, and yet his father's conclusion had been that Lutz should become a paper-making craftsman. A craftsman, not a merchant. The dream he'd been fighting for since the beginning had been redirected into the one acceptable shape his father could understand. "I don't want to be a craftsman," said Lutz flatly. "I want to leave this town and do business in other cities. Like Benno." Myne nodded. She understood completely. Once paper-making was running on its own, she wanted to hand it off and move on to books. And books, she and Lutz both quietly acknowledged, meant nobles, rich people, cities, travel. The very map they'd studied in the Merchants Guild had shown them the outline of that future. She was still turning that thought over in her head when soft footsteps approached. "Are you Myne, pray tell?" The girl standing before them had light rose-colored hair, brown eyes, and the kind of polished, composed bearing usually reserved for adults twice her age. She looked young, shorter than Myne had expected, which was saying something, but the way she carried herself suggested either an extremely good upbringing or extremely intensive training, probably both. Myne had been bracing herself to meet a girl who resembled the guildmaster. This was not that. Benno had worried for nothing. Freida glanced at Lutz with a slight pout, having hoped for a girls-only meeting. Myne, still holding Lutz's hand, explained quietly that she passed out frequently and wasn't allowed outside without him. Freida's expression changed immediately. "Do you perhaps suffer from the devouring?" The unfamiliar phrase made Myne tilt her head. Freida tilted hers in the opposite direction. Was there perhaps a heat in her body that acted independent of her will? There was. Myne and Lutz both leaned forward at once, stunned. Freida said it simply. She had once been sick with the same disease. Her small body was proof. And as for the cure, it cost a fortune. The word landed like a stone, and Myne's shoulders slumped with the weight of it. The guildmaster's granddaughter, who grew up counting gold coins, called it a fortune. But then Freida said something that changed everything. "As long as you remain dedicating your all to a singular purpose, you will be fine. Just be careful when your spirit shatters. That is when it will rise in strength." Myne went quiet, processing. She had nearly died the day she gave up on the Mokan. She had been healthy lately, running to the forest, making paper, finding purpose after purpose. Was she like a tuna that would die if she stopped swimming? She wasn't sure whether that thought was frightening or oddly liberating. A little of both, probably. Freida led them to the guildmaster's home, which was so close to the inner wall that the temple was visible from the front door. The second floor of the parlor was unlike anything Myne had ever walked into. Tapestries on every wall, stone-carved animals on every shelf. A rainbow of cushions and colors that made it clear this family hovered just below the nobility in wealth and status. A servant brought drinks, foul old juice sweetened with honey, tasting like the best raspberry drink Myne had ever imagined. "So sweet! This stuff is great, Lutz." "It really is. I love it." When Myne explained why they were there, that the guildmaster had commissioned a hairpin for the upcoming winter baptism, Freida gave her a look of quiet amusement. She had known her grandfather would order one without consulting her. Myne had simply saved him from his own worst instincts. The baptism outfit Freida brought out was white wool with red embroidery, warm to look at and a world apart from the layers and layers that poor families piled on in winter. Myne looked at the rich red thread and at Freida's light pink hair and immediately had her answer. Dark red roses. She asked if Freida had leftover thread from the embroidery. Freida handed over a clump large enough to embroider another outfit entirely. And then Myne noticed Freida's hairstyle. Twintails. 2 bunches. She would need 2 hairpins, not one. The look of pure relief that crossed Myne's face was genuine, not just because it made the whole arrangement feel slightly less like a robbery, but because she had just narrowly prevented a genuine disaster. One hairpin, designed for Tuli's green hair, made in secret as a surprise for a girl wearing pink twintails. It would have been a catastrophe. This brought them to the question of price. Myne, feeling guilty about the thread, offered to make the second one free. Freida, who had the soul of a merchant, insisted on paying the agreed price for both. They argued back and forth until Lutz, who had been largely silent, scratched his head and cut through the whole thing. Why not just make the second one half price? They both stared at him. That was, as Myne said immediately, genius. Freida tilted her head and looked at Myne with something that might have been pity. Don't you know that when you get the chance to earn money, you should take it and profit as much as you possibly can? Myne recognized those words. Benno had said something very similar once. She told Freida she thought there was a limit to that, and that anyway, a compromise was a compromise. Freida laughed, not derisively, but with the warm amusement of someone who had found another person standing on a very different side of a fence she understood well. The second round of fall-old juice arrived just as they should have been leaving, and Lutz's eyes locked onto the cups with an expression that made all thoughts of departure disappear. In the comfortable pause that followed, Myne asked what Freida did with her time, imagining something like embroidery or music lessons. Rich girl hobbies. My favorite thing to do is... Freida paused, then giggled. Counting money, perhaps? Myne blinked. Oh, that's not entirely accurate. It's not just counting money that I love, but saving it up as well. The weight of a bag of money fills me with joy, and no sound is more pleasant than coins rubbing together. Don't you agree? Myne forced out a sound of polite agreement while shutting her eyes. She had asked. She had genuinely asked about Freida's hobby, imagining candy making or fancy needlework, and been rewarded with this. Freida, eyes shining with the particular joy that Myne only ever felt in the presence of books, went on to describe the pleasure of counting her grandfather's monthly gold coin earnings, with trembling lips and flushed cheeks, with utter bliss. Then Freida took Myne's hand, looked directly into her eyes, and said, I think I've come to like you quite a lot. Would you work with me? No, said Lutz, before Myne could react. What followed was, word for word, the same conversation they'd had the day before with the guildmaster. Same offer, same history of the store, same logic about Myne not being officially Benno's apprentice yet. Freida even offered to repay Benno on Myne's behalf, which caused Lutz's expression to flatten completely. Myne, you gotta be firm, like yesterday. Freida, I decline. Freida's eyes didn't fill with tears. They narrowed slightly, as if her competitive spirit had been lit. That's a shame, but there is still plenty of time until your baptism. We will meet again, I'm sure. She smiled, and Myne felt cold sweat running down her back. She was a mouse staring at a snake who had just blocked all the exits. They walked home through a city that suddenly felt both more and less safe than before. Lutz gave his verdict when Myne asked. Freida was like Myne. Same obsession, different subject. Myne talked about books the way Freida talked about money. The same expression, the same intensity, the same gap between how they looked and what was actually going on inside them. Myne decided she needed a few minutes to feel terrible about that. She got them on the walk to Benno's store, where Mark intercepted them before they could continue home. Benno was, according to Mark, fidgety. They went in. Myne described Freida as a cute little lady. Benno told her to stop sugarcoating it. She sighed and told the truth. Freida had been watching the guildmaster work since birth, and the concepts of expanding business and capitalizing on opportunity weren't something she'd been taught. They were simply how she thought. Natural merchant talent, the kind that made Myne slightly scared of her. You think she's amazing too, huh? Said Benno and scratched his head. Then came the confession. Freida had given them her embroidery thread to use, and Myne, unable to justify charging double when the materials were free, had offered to make both hairpins for the price of one. Lutz had stepped in with the half-price compromise. Benno looked at Myne the way a doctor looks at a patient who has done something very stupid. You're not going to survive as a merchant if taking money makes you feel guilty. He went on to explain what she hadn't thought of. Rumors. If word got out that their store gave a free hairpin with every purchase, they would be dealing with those customers forever. Pick your battles. Know what happens if you lose. Myne slumped her shoulders and apologized. At least she had charged for the second one. Back home that evening, Myne hugged Thule and declared her an angel, a healer of the heart, and the greatest older sister in the world, before admitting that she was a weird little sister who acted way differently from how she looked. Thule sighed, patted her head, and pointed her toward the kitchen. The family dinner that followed was livelier than usual. Myne reported on the hairpin commission, the devouring, and the guildmaster's house. Mom was most interested in the tapestries. Dad wanted to know about the alcohol collection. Thule asked about Freida's clothes. When Myne showed them the deep red embroidery thread, both Mom and Thule went very still and then started handling it with an intensity that made it clear they recognized immediately how expensive it was. Dad made extra needles without being asked. Thule started sewing roses alongside Myne and was faster within minutes. Mom, who had been watching so closely she'd already figured out the technique, joined them and was fastest of all, which meant that Myne, the one actually being paid, was also the slowest. Dad also offered to make the wooden pins. Myne turned him down diplomatically. That was Lutz's job, and if Lutz didn't make the pins, he'd have no excuse to come with her to Freida's, and no work to be paid for. Dad pouted. Myne redirected him by asking for a hair stick with a hole in the tip for her own baptism ceremony. Dad cheered up immediately and started carving. The next day, they bought thread, quality white to match Freida's red, plus cheap thread in every color for the winter handiwork. On the way home, Myne told Lutz she'd already used all the red thread. His eyes went wide. "You're already done? You said you'd take your time." Mom and Thule helped. They were way faster than me. Somewhere in saying it aloud, Myne realized something. Merchants sold things made by others. That was how it worked. Her family sewing flowers while Lutz made the pins wasn't a compromise. It was just commerce. The finished hairpins were a bouquet of 4 deep red roses with tiny white accent flowers per pin, slightly more elaborate than Thule's, as felt right given the price. Myne sewed the pins onto the flowers, wrapped them in a handkerchief, and they were ready. Delivering them turned out to be more complicated than planned. They stopped at the Merchants Guild to formally request an appointment with the guildmaster and were immediately ushered upstairs without waiting. Benno, who had come along to oversee the transaction, had barely opened his mouth before the guildmaster looked at the finished hairpins with wide eyes. "I didn't expect them to turn out so splendid. These will surely suit Freida perfectly." That should have been the end of it. Benno stood up to leave, taking Myne and Lutz with him. The guildmaster stopped them. He wanted them to deliver the hairpins to Freida directly. She had been very happy, he said, to have made a friend her age. Benno crouched next to Myne and whispered, "You ended up friends with that geezer's granddaughter?" Myne had no good answer. Before she could think of one, the guildmaster picked her up, efficiently, as if he did it all the time, and walked out of the office with her. Benno and Lutz chased after them in what could only be described as mild panic. A carriage was involved. The guildmaster's carriage seated 2 adults comfortably, which left Myne and Lutz wedged on the luggage bump, bouncing along cobblestone roads with no suspension. Myne kept launching upward. Benno pulled her onto his lap and held her down. Carriages, Myne concluded, were not graceful. Freida met them with a gentle smile and light pink hair that fluttered as she walked. Benno and the guildmaster introduced themselves with the particular tension of 2 people pretending to be civil while conducting invisible warfare. Myne's back went cold. Lutz squeezed her hand. Neither of them was ready to join whatever was happening between those 2 smiles. The adults went to another room to talk. Myne and Lutz were taken to the parlor, where honey-soaked nut tarts on thin pastry were waiting on the table. Nom nom. They tasted exactly as delicious as they smelled, which was very. Myne tried to return the leftover thread before presenting the hairpins. Freida declined. Myne insisted. She had concluded from the bottom of her heart that nothing was scarier than something free. Free things came with strings attached. She had learned that from the guildmaster. The hairpins came out of the handkerchief, and Freida's cheeks flushed immediately. She pulled the basket toward her, placed 6 small silvers in front of Myne and Lutz and said, "I've accepted the products and paid their price. Now we can become friends without any hesitation." There was no escape. Myne looked around, found none, and gave up gracefully. "Want to take a look at the hairpins, Freida?" She did. Myne stuck the ornaments into the strings of Freida's twintails, and the deep red roses against her light pink hair were everything Myne had hoped for. Lutz, who did not compliment things lightly, said she looked crazy cute, which made Freida puff out her cheeks and blush in a way that made it very obvious she had never had friends or siblings to compliment her. Then Freida took a hairpin out and examined it with the sharp eyes of a merchant. To think you could make such realistic flowers with mere thread. Discovering the way to do something is very important, Myne. She paused. Wives and daughters of wealthier nobles wear embroidered clothing. Some even wear flowers preserved with magic. But no one has ever worn a hair ornament sewn like this. Realistic flowers made of thread such as these are revolutionary. Myne's face went white. Revolutionary. She had made a revolutionary product and then charged half price for it. The blood draining from her face must have been visible because Freida immediately took her hand. The conversation that ended the visit was a negotiation of its own kind. Freida wanted Myne to come visit her for girls' talk. Lutz, standing firm, said they'd be too busy with winter preparations. Freida wanted to know about Peru cakes, which Lutz apparently preferred to Freida's candy. Myne tried to explain that Peru cakes were made from bird food leftovers and were not appropriate for a rich girl's refined diet. Freida pouted so hard her lips pointed straight out. The compromise. In spring, when Freida's kitchen and chef were available, they would make candy together. It was a surprisingly nice note to end on. When Benno came back from his meeting with the guildmaster, he sorted the money in the parlor. 3 small silvers for his handling fee and materials. 1 small silver each for Myne and Lutz, plus 5 large coppers to take home. On the walk back from the Merchants' Guild, Lutz asked why Myne was saving in the guild every time instead of taking everything home. She told him about startup funds, about how impossible papermaking would have been without Benno funding every tool they needed, about how moving forward, more tools, new products, books would cost money they had to build up themselves, because Benno had told them he was done paying once the prototypes were done. Lutz was quiet for a moment, and then Myne said the thing she hadn't wanted to say. "If your family still won't let you become a merchant after your baptism, what will you do?" He scrunched his face. "I was thinking I'd ask Benno to let me be a live-in apprentice." "I'm glad you didn't say you'd give up." She smiled, and he let out a small breath of relief. Then she told him something he hadn't thought of yet. If he ran away from home to become an apprentice, there would be a gap before his first pay. He would need money for apprentice clothes, for food until that first payment came. His life and his ability to fight for his dream would be completely different depending on whether he had his own savings. Lutz's head came up, understanding landing on his face all at once. He was already making more than his brother Ralph, who had just started his apprenticeship. He had nothing to feel guilty about. "Thanks, Myne, I feel a lot better." "I'm glad," she said, and then Lutz crouched down in front of her. He offered to carry her home. She protested. He pointed out that he'd be carrying all the thread on the way back tomorrow, and that she looked like she was already on the edge of her limit. She climbed onto his back. Her mother went pale when she saw the 5 large coppers. Myne handed them over. Her mother froze. Lutz confirmed that yes, it was real money, and everything they said about hairpins being expensive was true. Mom sent Myne straight to bed. Myne lay down with every intention of just resting for a moment. She woke up the next morning, having missed supper entirely. Her family wouldn't let her out of bed until 4th bell. By the time she and Lutz climbed onto his back again to go see Benno, he insisted, and she was tired enough not to argue. The meeting was just about settling the price for the winter handiwork. 3 large coppers per hairpin. Starting high, working down as the market filled. Benno explained the reasoning. Myne thought about her own family and realized they could afford one, barely, if they were careful about it for a month. That was the point. Their share, 5 middle coppers each per hairpin, after Benno's handling and materials fees. Myne said that felt scandalously low. Benno pointed out that normal handiwork paid less than 1 middle copper per piece. They were being generous. Okay, how much are things made as winter handiwork usually worth? Usually a single middle copper if they're lucky, usually less. She had helped Thule make baskets the previous winter without being paid at all, never thinking about the economics of it. Benno reminded her, gently but firmly, to keep the design exactly the same for every hairpin, no variations. She had a habit of putting extra effort into things when bored, and the last time she'd done that, she'd accidentally made the fancy baskets that had sent Benno on a citywide investigation to find who made them. She gave a small, mortified apology. He told her not to worry about it. Then he handed her a wooden card to take home and read, something for studying over the winter, and squeezed her cheek when she tried to look at it right there. I said, look at it after you get home. Understand? Yesh. Sheesh. He told Lutz to make sure she didn't read it on the way home and get hit by something. Myne, who remembered very clearly what had happened the last time she read while walking in her previous life, kept her mouth shut and looked away.